This is a One More Mosh Pit production.
Man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. I'm the one saying to his brain.
I don't even know how to start these things, really. The subject matter outlined and all that, and I have a whole written narrative here, but I don't know how to start these podcasts. I can't just jump in with the introduction. I've got to have like a little bullshit beginning so I can crossfade the music with it, and it can come in with this talking, but I don't really ever have anything planned. A lot of other podcasts you listen to, there's a solid 5 minutes of just banter before they get into the subject matter at hand. I've got so much shit here, and I'm like, I gotta get this done because we talk enough anyway.
Well, in most podcasts, it sounds like they start recording way before the podcast starts, and then they just cut out a big chunk of it because a lot of them are halfway in the middle of a conversation, it sounds like.
Right, it sounds like they were talking, and then the recording just started at some candid point in the conversation. Anyway, this is Horrible History Abridged, the Donner Party. This is Zach, and we're going to be wrapping up the Donner Party story today. It's been exhausting, and it's going to feel good to get this wrapped up here. Someday this podcast will find its voice. Someday I'll find my own identity and voice, and we can get that figured out from there. I don't know what the end game is with all this, but I'll probably keep doing it, I guess. Let's kind of figure out where we were last time in the story. The Forlorn Hope, or at least what was left of it, had made it to Johnson Ranch, and they had secured their survival because they got their efforts could be launched to go save the rest back at the old settlements near Truckee Lake. From some aspects, you can look at it and go, okay, that's the end of the story, but like, we got to figure out what's been going on at Truckee Lake.
Yeah, we left half
And
the party back there.
what's left of that group and what happens from here on out. We still got a whole lot of story left, so I can stop selling it now and we can just jump right into it. We talked about if the Forlorn Hope had went the right way and made all the right decisions and made it there was a lot of things that could have been avoided. We're going to get into those today. By the time the Forlorn Hope had limped into Johnson's Ranch, even by then, the Reaper had flown through camp. You remember all the bachelors that were out in the elements and they were yumming up on mice and buffalo hide and all that shit? Well, they were all dead, save for one of them. Jacob Donner was among the deceased. We knew him as being sickly anyway, but having given up hope, his life force would leave him short after as he laid down and died figuratively. And we talked about thinking about people literally lying down in the snow and dying, which you imagine happened in the
Just
story.
knowing they weren't going to wake.
And we've seen some examples of people literally laying down and dying already. Margaret Reed and all the Reed children were still alive. Margaret said she kept the kids fed by feeding them oxen hide and boiling the discarded oxen bones. I don't want to be cynical, but that claim sounds very dubious.
It seems
that like none of the little Reed children picked a little something off a corpse or something like that, a toe at least. But that's what she claimed. She claimed she fed them this oxen bone broth and whatever else. But then again, the Reeds did have relatively better resources than some of the people there, even though the father figure, the patriarch, had been sent out.
Exactly.
Yeah. The rescue efforts were organized and in full swing. They would arrive in staggered waves. So here comes the first relief, the first group that would venture to Truckee Lake. The group consisted of a motley crew of mercenaries and rough and tough do-gooders. Members of the first relief were paid $3 a day, which was unheard of at the time for something like that, which is for us today is a little below $100, give or take a little more for inflation, which some people today would think that would be a pretty good gig. They made it to Truckee Lake 2 weeks after setting out. Their trip was not without difficulty, but these guys knew what they were doing. They'd been there before.
Yeah, dragging along any kid.
And they knew which way to go, and they knew the best way to do it. They got to the camp, and though they knew they were in the right location geographically, they thought there was some kind of mistake. It didn't look like a camp at all, and it was because the camp was covered with 20 feet of snow. They got closer, and there were no signs of life. However, there were plenty of signs of death. The camp was littered with corpses. They saw ramps that were dug out from the doors of the cabins and makeshift lodgings. They had to dig down into the place they were staying, or out in some cases. And when somebody passed, somebody died, they were just dragged up the incline and left in the snow, and then everybody went back inside. And the camp seemed lifeless. The men, fearing they were too late to save anyone, began to call out, "Hello!" The calls were were answered by faint, barely audible voice of a frail woman who would drag herself up one of these snow ramps, and when she saw the members of the First Relief, she inquired as to whether they were from California or heaven. So
that's got to be a big revelation. You see these gross, disgusting outdoorsmen. Are you angels?
Yeah, probably mad by then. 22 folks were rescued and brought back by the First Relief, mostly children. Scores of others were left to be scooped up by the subsequent relief efforts on their way. Margaret Reed and 4 of the Reed children were included in the first round collected. Only 2 of the 22 would die on the trek back, so they'd get 22 people and 2 of them wouldn't make the trip.
I mean, that's terrible odds by normal standards,
right,
but by these standards, that's not...
22 already dying people, and you had to march them even further. Still pretty good numbers, all things considered. One of the people that would perish on the trip back was 3-year-old Ada Kesselberg. It took the members of the First Relief an entire day of the trip to convince Ada's mother, Philippine, to leave the dead child behind. The man who finally convinced her to abandon the little one's corpse, and in a later account would remark, the child's spirit had went to heaven, her body to the wolves. Very poetic.
I mean, that would have been tough. Like we said, it's so long ago, it seems very...
Yeah, the distance kind of makes it unreal, right, like we've discussed
a little
earlier.
Easier to listen to and learn about.
Kesselberg, remember that name, because there's another character we're going to introduce you to by the end of it. Very pretty important for reasons. As the First Relief crossed the pass, they would meet the Second Relief on their way to Truckee Lake. The Second Relief was led by none other than James Reed. Big hero James Reed.
Oh yeah, over the hillside with the sun at his back, I'm sure.
Reed was full into his redemption arc here. Having lost a battle in the Mexican-American War, he just took leave. I lost once, I'm done.
He had other things to do anyway. Obviously, he couldn't take off right away because of weather, but...
Yeah, he had to bounce as soon as the juice stopped being worth a squeeze because he had other shit he had to do. He went to San Francisco where he would raise $1,000 for the rescue effort.
Good.
And that's good for 18 whatever's money. And he'd gotten in good with the Navy. He got some help from some sailors and any volunteers and help he could get from there. That's great. Margaret almost crumbled upon seeing him. He embraced his wife and he got to see 4 of his children still living and learned his remaining children were still alive at the camp. The reunion was sweet but short. He had to keep going so he could save the other 2 kids and others from the camp. So having cleared Truckee Lake, the Second Relief would venture to the Donner camp at Alder Creek. What he and the Second Relief saw was chilling evidence of cannibalism carried out by those remaining in the Donner camp. Reed and his men entered the Murphy cabin. Sprinkled about the floor were human bones that had been visibly gnawed, next to piles of indigestible hair and whatnot. The cabin was full of children, weakened and writhing in their bedding. The children were under the care of a single woman, Lavina Murphy. Reed was horrified at the realization that it was the children that had picked these bones clean. One of the men of the Second Relief would write that the survivors resembled demons rather than humans.
Yeah. Can you imagine just walking in there and smell? I mean, it was cold outside. That probably helped the smell. Just these feral children and bones. I mean, God, it'd be like going into a bear cave or something.
Oh, definitely a bear cave with bald, human-looking cubs.
Yeah.
The Donners, too, resorted to cannibalism. Jacob Donner's corpse was fodder for sustenance. The Donner children devoured their uncle, as George Donner reportedly wept at the sight of his children eating his only sibling.
Everything in that statement is understandable.
Yeah,
I mean, the kids eating the corpse and the dad crying.
If there's any time to have a cry, it is at that point.
And if there's any time to eat a body, I guess it's that point too.
Right. And that goes back to being judgmental about history because you don't know what you would have done. You don't know how well you would have handled it and held it together. Don't be all judgy about it, even though I am in multiple parts in telling this story.
Well, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, than just...
Well, I'm being judgmental, kind of embellishing my reactions to stuff because you have to do that in an infotainment framework.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying not to judge them so much on morality in situations that are very unfamiliar to us living today. What you had to do to survive.
Little boy Bloom, he needed the money. Oh!
The Second Relief brought out 17 for rescue, 3 adults and 14 children. They would settle down for the night in the exact worst place imaginable. A lot of luck stuff goes into the story too, like I've mentioned, and lack of expertise didn't help that luck, but luck plays into the story a lot outside of bonehead decisions.
A huge percentage of catastrophe is just bad luck.
Wrong place, wrong time stuff. Well, this place was a host to like the worst blizzards in the Sierra Nevadas. This is like the blizzard highlight reel location.
It's like like Tornado Alley. It's like in Arkansas, it's like Bologna.
We're just
This
going
is
to
the place
rebuild.
that always gets hit.
Let's move here and let's build our house on a target, unlike today, where you take that gamble upon yourself of building a house in somewhere that might be dangerous. They didn't have that kind of...
Well, no, it was 3 adults and 14 kids. They stopped where they stopped. They didn't know where they were. They had no idea.
They did have the relief, though, that was bringing them. They basically had James Reed as a chaperone.
Okay.
And
so
he has
this is
to
the
leave,
group
as you see.
This is the group that's already been rescued.
This is also a group that gets a name in the history text, as we'll see. More about this place where they had settled down for a night. About 100 years in the future from when they settled here, this site would be the home of Walt Disney's Sugar Bowl Ski Resort. It claimed to receive the most snowfall of any resort in California, and I'm sure Walt Disney wasn't bullshitting on that, and I'm sure he picked that location because of it. Also, just a stone's throw away from where they set up, currently there is a meteorology lab there, and the chief purpose of the lab is for recording and studying extreme weather conditions.
Right. Probably did not.
They didn't
even
know
the
this.
rescuers have to.
This is just for reference of just about how bad
They thought they saw the rescue relief and were just relieved. I mean, they couldn't be excited. They didn't have the energy for excitement, but they were, just relieved and like, oh, it's over. Now we just have to get where we're going.
Very much survival mode in the most
literal
and legitimate definition. March 5th would bring a wicked storm.
And to drive the point home, March 5th, they left in the middle of May.
Yeah.
And this was supposed to be a 4-month journey.
Yeah, and
It's been
about
10
rounding
months.
out a year here. The cold had people crowding in the fire pit. One man stood so close to it that the flames would burn through 4 layers of clothing, and he didn't notice and back off until the burning had reached skin.
And then what's he supposed to do?
Until his skin was warmed up enough to feel.
Then what is he supposed to do? It's not like he has a change of clothes or something.
Right.
He probably had to abandon everything.
The snowbank would rise everywhere. So like it's still snowing, so the snowbank is getting bigger and bigger except for this fire pit. As the snow piled up, the fire pit appeared to be buried, and it was like 10 feet deep at a certain point. 17 survivors are down in here around the pit, and it's like some kind of burrow. And like many times before in this story, food would run out. Elizabeth Graves would give up the ghost, leaving behind her daughter Nancy in the group. The group collectively decided that James Reed ride ahead to Johnson's ranch and send back more help. Reed headed out and left the survivors at what would later be called Starved Camp in later accounts. 1 living adult and 14 children were the inhabitants of Starved Camp. The first night, the child count would fall to 13 as Jacob Donner's son, 5-year-old Isaac, would freeze to death. Also, the first night, a gesture would be made that was so chilling it rivaled the blizzard. 7-year-old Mary Donner would, in a very matter-of-fact manner, suggest cannibalism, noting the 2 dead people that now inhabited the camp.
I just don't find that super chilling. It's chilling for the rescue group, for the people who have come to rescue them, because they haven't witnessed this, but the people that have been with her all along were probably like, oh yeah, good point.
Aside from the trauma and severe hardships that she'd faced, little Mary Donner was a normal child at the time. She wasn't evil, she wasn't a ghoul, she was young and she was impressionable, she was still learning about life, and this aloof attitude was acquired at this point. Her acceptance of one of the biggest taboos in humanity, it came from her observing adults over the last few months.
From her literally starving to death.
Right, being hungry and having to do that. Like earlier in the year at the Alder Creek camp, Jacob Donner's wife, Elizabeth Donner, was cooking, and Mary would come up and ask, what's for dinner? Just like mundanely, what are we eating tonight? Elizabeth apparently smiled at Mary and replied in an almost sing-songy manner, what do you think we had for last night, Mr. So-and-so's arm? To the children of the Alder Lake camp, this is a very normalized practice.
I mean, you gotta, as a parent too, you probably have to kind of normalize this for your children to keep them from being completely freaking out and crying. They're probably already crying nonstop. I mean, you can't let them see how bothered you are.
It's important to add levity to every situation in your life. That's why I'm making funny stories about this account of these poor people that ended up having to eat each other. You have to add a little silliness to life, otherwise you're just going to go fucking nuts.
These people are already nuts after all.
So the rescuers that came to Starved Camp were understandably disgusted and horrified, much like most of the rescue efforts that find these people in this situation. In situations like this, the children had made short work of Isaac Donner's remains. He was a little guy. He'd been starving. So they moved on to the relative buffet that was Liz Graves' body. The children had managed to strip most of the flesh from Elizabeth's bones. As had become standard, they ate the heart and liver, as well as eating entirely her breasts. Which, children already associate the tits with a meal anyway.
Yeah. This fact that the kids are literally just gnawing into somebody's body. It's not being butchered and cooked for them anymore.
Pick the bones clean.
Why don't we just head out, when all these kids fall asleep?
But also they participated in the process that they'd seen of harvesting the edible organs, so they had a little bit of expertise to it by then. But I imagine they just went to biting.
Probably.
But unbeknownst to Nancy Graves at the time, she didn't know it, but she'd eaten her own mom.
Her would have wanted.
Yeah, as we've seen earlier in the story of parents suggesting, eat me after I'm dead.
Yeah, if you're a parent and you don't want children to eat your body when you're dead, you're just a piece of shit.
Right.
Come on.
I mean, I'm offering up to the dogs.
You don't have 5 cats.
Yeah, I'm donating my remains to the dog. So then we got all these rescuers getting there, and they see this awful scene, and they're absorbing the weight of the situation in abominable detail. All the evidence is laid out, and they still got the very gory Kool-Aid mustaches.
Yeah.
So these career rescuers, they entertain the horrible thought of just going, let's just leave them here.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
You don't fucking come back from this.
Right, exactly. They're looking at these kids and they're like, God, we're going to take this group of rabid, feral, bloodthirsty children back to California.
We're not going to come and introduce these little baby girls into fucking society.
Yeah.
How do you become a normal person? How do you integrate back into society? It's such like an important point in your development.
Yeah.
You have this shit happen.
Kids are resilient, though. They can bounce back.
3 men in the group stepped up and they said, fuck that. We're not leaving these kids out here. We're going to save them for better or worse, because they couldn't just leave children out there to die. Despite what these kids did, most people should be glad to know that they would never have to make this decision that, should I save this kid or is this kid worth saving? So the gallant trio of men would carry all the children back to Johnson's Ranch. Among the 3 was John Stark, who rescued 9 children on his own. This hero would carry a child a short distance, sit him or her down, go back and grab another one, just ad infinitum for several miles until the 9 children were brought back.
This guy should be more well known.
Very good and heroic, like the Starks of Game of Thrones.
I wonder if he got that on this.
George R.R. Martin. No. We've had a couple of rescue efforts come through, but Truckee Lake in the meantime would only become an uglier scene. I'm going to introduce a new character here that's been along, but he hadn't done much of note.
When you introduce someone this late in the story, it's either really good or really bad.
I told you Kesselberg, to remember that name. Louis Kesselberg, once again somebody I haven't referenced directly. His wife and daughter had left with that first relief. Ada, his daughter, as you know, wouldn't make it. Up until this point in the story, Louis Kesselberg himself really must have not done much of note, besides he stepped on a sharp stick and injured his foot. This was an injury that kind of rendered him useless amidst a time where folks could barely help themselves. He had acquired an injury that either legitimately or because of malingering made him unable to be of help in this dire time. I know I've been harping on the not judging people part, but this guy is going to test that a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's hazy what actually happened, but there's a lot of evidence to this guy not having the best character. And some people, it only gets brought out in very dire situations, but
yeah, and there's some evidence that his actions were not equal to anyone else's actions.
There's a little extra cutesiness to it that makes you not have any sympathy. When the foster couple departed with forlorn hope, they left behind a very small child, George, which I don't know why a small child George was not priority, or why his parents couldn't bring him with them,
or why they both had to go and leave him.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Yeah, and if you remember the Fosters from the middle section of the story, they were the people that got a little too into the cannibalism. Right, yeah. I don't know if you believe in karma or any of that shit, but maybe there's a little bit of that at play here.
Because maybe George's dad was the one that came back and had killed the 2 Miwok scouts.
It's a very paying for the sins of your father. I don't know, you could look at this in a lot of ways. One night back at camp, Louis Kesselberg would take the 1-year-old George Foster to his bed with him, which already weird. Already, how did anybody else let that happen? Unless it was under the guise of keeping the child warm or whatever.
Nobody had the energy.
Yeah, right.
At least I don't have to take it.
George Foster, of course, wouldn't make it to the morning. How the child perished is unknown, lost to time. Whether the exposure and cold and hunger finally got to him, or if it was a mouth-covering, breath-stalling palm from Kesselberg, we don't know. We just know the kid died, and it was with Kesselberg. Whatever happened happened while the kid was still breathing kind of becomes inconsequential when you compare it to what happened after it stopped breathing. Kesselberg hanged the child's body on a peg in his room like one would hang meat. The boy would dangle like a suckling pig until he got hungry and took this macabre decoration down. So already making your mind up about this guy, that's a key thing to consider. So William Foster had made it and had somewhat assimilated back into civilized society and dropped, or at least hid, craving for human meat.
That kind of points to your theory about his wife whispering in his ear about, let's kill one of them and eat them.
Yeah, just suggest them Ewoks. Nobody's gonna miss them. They're not really helping anyone. So he was back being a human again in society. He would come back to Truckee Lake and Alder Camp with the third relief to retrieve his boy and the others. So he's given back to maybe trying to atone at this point. I don't know. Yeah. Make good. Well, he would make the terrible discovery that Kesselberg had eaten his only begotten son, and his mind once again leaned towards murder. But Foster would refrain, and he would say that he had had his fill of it for his lifetime.
Yeah, I wouldn't. That was one last.
I would definitely turn around, look the other way, and testify on his behalf if it came up. Understandable. Nonetheless, Foster would tell Kesselberg that if he ever crossed his path in California, he would kill him where he stood. And according to some sources, William Eddy was also on this relief team as well, and found out his children may have met a similar fate. Depending on what sources you're looking at, Foster and Eddy are interchangeable for some reason, because they both have the same first name, or just shit that's lost to time. But both or either of them could have been threatening. Nevertheless, I read more about George Foster being the victim here described. Foster, Eddy, and the third relief would leave Kesselberg there for the upcoming fourth relief to deal with. The fourth relief was a different animal of sorts, as we'll find out. April 13th, 1847 is when the fourth relief set out. So at this point, it had been 11 months since the Darners and Reeds and the rest left Independence, Missouri on this fateful trip. There was just 4 survivors remaining in the Darner camp for the last relief to come scoop up if they lived. I mean, I don't know if there was some kind of triage on this, who was getting taken or whatever, or the most likely to live being taken first, or it wasn't women and children, but it was definitely children. The last 4 left in camp here broke down and disabled because of the gangrene arm. George Donner and his doting wife, Tamsin, who refused to leave his side. The last Donner camp. There was Lavina Murphy, and she was the caretaker of the children in that one cabin. Originally in the Forlorn Hope, the 2 boys that didn't have snowshoes left out, and the older one went out, the Give Me My Bone boy. She may have been those boys' parent. They got the same last name. I'm not sure about their relations, but given the circumstances, you could imagine they were related in some way. But she was the caretaker of all the children, if you remember, and she had just mentally deteriorated to a point that was unsalvageable, maybe, and she was nearly blind by that point.
Do you know if was she already visually impaired, or you think snow blindness had...
there were probably a bunch of contributors to it. I imagine snow blindness didn't help. I imagine she'd seen enough at this point that she didn't need her vision. She was like maybe clawing them out, Event Horizon style.
Well, I mean, when your body starts eating itself and you're in like ketoacidosis or whatever, breath smells like acetone.
Oh, definitely. They weren't expecting to find her alive when they got back. And of course, the 4th member left, the ghoulish, monstrous Kesselberg. Let's see, I'm going to put extra mean, negative adjectives on his name, even though I'm really not sure what happened, but fuck him anyway. I'm not contributing to his life being worse because he's dead. I'm not trying to cancel Kesselberg here. The 4th relief had its share of unique frontier characters. It was led by the flamboyant mountain man William Legros Fallon. Legros means the big in French, so like nicknames were a new thing. It was like when Undertaker wanted the name Mean Mark Callis back in the day. Just adjective. Didn't find much like historically archived on the guy, but his bio reads like a series of dollar store Bill Brasky, Chuck Norris facts he made up himself.
Right.
like he wrote his bio, fist fighting a bear and riding a hurricane.
Exactly. And any good things that he'd read about, he probably attributed to himself. Like, I once rescued 9 children by trekking back and forth in the snow, and I'd leave one and go back and get the others until they were all safe.
And the guy he's bragging to, he goes, both of us just read that, right? That guy just told both us that story. You can't put yourself in it now. I was there, dude. Like, you've ever had a friend or had an acquaintance that was such a compulsive liar that they'll tell a story in which you were involved in front of you and make up the most bullshit lies about it, like you're not going to go, no, I was there and I don't remember any of that shit. That's not how it happened. I don't know if he was like that or not, but he was noted as being flamboyant, so I'm taking liberties with how he would have been.
And just the stories of his life, they seem like they must be a little exaggerated.
Yeah, William Fallon. I guess he was French. Legros, maybe he was Jimmy Fallon's great grandfather.
Huh, maybe.
And he just like laughed at people's jokes
way
too much.
He just giggled a lot.
Yeah, like everything was the most hilarious thing in the world. The intentions of the Fourth Relief weren't as vigilant and righteous as previous relief efforts. There were only 4 folks left out there. At best, they were going to drag 1 or 2 back with them. They're all infirm or just otherwise in bad shape when they left, so they don't even know if they're going to find these people. The Fourth Relief was after loot, because there's still a whole lot of it out there. They set out to see what treasures they would find among the goods and valuables left behind. They would collect everything they could carry, and saving everyone was an afterthought. Besides, they knew about what could be found around the abandoned belongings. A comprehensive manifest was made of each wagon. The source material I use goes way in depth into all that stuff. Listen, I spared you all the wagon manifest
we don't
shit.
need to know.
But a comprehensive manifest was made to inventory the contents of every wagon, as overbearing bureaucracy already pervaded early America. There had to be riches to be found at this camp. And I mean, even though they started dropping shit and like losing weight on the wagons, and they held on to their money.
Right.
These families, they needed that money when they got there.
Yeah, exactly. More stuff, build new stuff.
Yeah, they could drop the oxbows, but they weren't getting rid of that cold cash on the way out. The riches, like I said, were documented. The Graves family literally had their wagon built around a little treasure chest that held the family's whole fortune. Yeah. So they had their money.
I mean, I'm sure it was a treasure. It was like their family safe. It was just like
but it was there was a compartment with their money in it, and it was the core of the framework that they built their wagon out of. The Fourth Relief would find the spot at Truckee Lake, and it looked like a proper murder scene, of course. The camp had severely mutilated limbs, torsos, and skulls strewn about. One of the men of the Fourth Relief, it wasn't his first rodeo, and he'd been there previously with the Second Relief, and he noted the change since his last visit. Upon the first visit, he'd seen the bodies laid around the camp, and he said it resembled the casualties on a battlefield after a skirmish had subsided. This time around, on a second viewing, he said the scenery was more akin to that of a slaughterhouse.
And it had probably thawed by then a lot, more than it had in his first
we're getting into spring. And
it was probably all melted, muddy, and all that gore.
Dumb. So onward to Alder Creek, to the Donner Camp. The last relief found things in even more grisly shape. They entered the lodgings of George Donner. George's head would be the only part of him there to greet the rescuers, and it was split almost nearly in twain long ways, and the brain had been scooped out. There was a strange pot simmering nearby, and of course that's where they found the brains. And isn't the brain the worst part to eat because of prawns and all
exactly.
that?
I don't think you're supposed to eat human brains. Some other animals, I don't know, but that's
mad cow disease.
Start eating holes in your brain and shit.
Maybe they saved him from eating this. And
entire cannibalistic tribes have been wiped out
from
eating brains.
Brains as a cuisine, as a connoisseur of eating weird things, brains has been something that I've actively avoided throughout my entire life. Like you hear hillbillies talk about eating scrambled eggs and squirrel brains and shit like that. Number one, I'm not gonna fuck around with squirrel skull open to get its brain. That's too much work. If the meat, a little bit of sustenance, has too much work between me and it, more than eating crawfish, I'm not gonna go through the effort. It's a big enough hassle skinning something and getting the meat off of it. So they see this brain boiling in the pot. It's around this time that they have the distinct honor of meeting this sweet gentleman, Louis Kesselberg. I imagine he ran screeching out of the shadows at them or some shit like
you
that.
Think? I see it more as him just being like, "Oh, come in, guys. Welcome. I've got some soup on the stove."
He's got a human skin apron on and shit like that.
Yeah.
Kiss the cook.
Like a poncho.
He looks like a ghoul. Like you believe it from him.
His story just makes me associate him with Albert Fish. That's how I imagine him.
Yeah, he is fishy. He's an old boogeyman. Yeah. We got to dig up the Cork Kesselberg to look for all the pins in his crotch. Some of them hit bone and they're still there. Just find a coffin with like a skeleton, and around the pelvic region there's just a
bunch
pile
of loose
pins
metal
and rusty ass. During autopsy, they didn't fucking take the time to empty Albert Fish.
Why the hell would you?
Why wouldn't you just throw Albert Fish in the fucking trash? That's one we'll never cover because I don't think you can. It's been done, which like most of these things have been done and better, but I would feel like I was on a balancing beam trying to be informative and tasteful enough. Like most stuff I've been talking about wanting to cover, there's not a big capacity for jokes in it.
And I mean, there's a lot of stuff about Fish that is laughable.
But there's a lot of
his
stuff
crimes, I don't want.
Yeah, but enough on Albert Fish. Yeah. So Kesselberg, after he burst from the shadows or was extra cordial to these men, given the grim and gross circumstances. In a grimly braggadocious tone, I guess you would say, he announced that not only was he the last survivor, but he had eaten the other three. Or at the very least, not something you open with.
Right, yeah, it's like, okay, everyone knows you're a freaking weirdo and the world's most hated man at the moment, but shut the fuck up. God, nobody wants to hear that. And what is your goal of being so braggy about this?
I mean, you could say, hey guys, don't worry about looking for the other three because they're done for, instead of like, I ate those other three, so you can just take me and we can go. I understand him. Or is this some kind of like, hey, don't freak out? He's bragging about it. I could see of him going, hey, don't freak out, but I kind of did some shit. I had to do this shit, but I'm going to explain to you what's going on. No, he just came out and said that not only had he eaten the other three, but Tamsin Donner was the best fucking thing he'd ever eaten, apparently. So he
wasn't just
throwing the Yelp review in here.
I did what I had to do to survive,
but it was fucking delicious and I enjoyed every minute. I don't have the exact account and dialogue of what is said. I just have the account of William LaGrosse and all these other guys, and I piece it together from that. He denied any murder, though. He assured the men that he did not partake upon the others until they'd passed on their own.
Well, that's good to know. Not only did he not murder, he did not start eating them until they had already died. Good.
According to the accounts of Kesselberg, Lavina Murphy would die within a week of the third relief departing.
Yeah,
that's plausible. She would probably fell through the net as far as the relief going. This one's probably not going to survive, and it's going to be a hassle bringing her back. So just leave her here, and she has probably been informed that at least if Lemuel Murphy was her son, she's been informed of his death. She probably doesn't have much will to live.
Well, she probably couldn't have physically made it back to wherever they were. It's not like one of those pirates was going to give her a piggyback ride.
Nobody. There's not going to be a Jon Stark to carry her, or a Targaryen for that matter. A dragon could have saved all those people.
Yeah, a lot of things.
I know they were cold out there, but they didn't have to deal with any White Walkers.
True. I wonder if they knew.
Kesselberg was the Night King.
Don't give him that credit.
No, that makes him sound too cool.
Yeah, exactly.
According to the Kesselberg's accounts, also, he claimed George Donner would kick the bucket later, which George Donner had one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel anyway. And at that point, Tamsin would leave camp in pursuit of her children and the relief efforts. Maybe be able to follow the ruts or footsteps out from that, since she had nothing left at camp to really worry about. He said she'd make it a little ways, and a fall in the creek would give her a chill, and she would return to camp before dying, but not before requesting that Kesselberg take her and George's remaining silver and take it to their children in California, which is always a dubious story if your angle is this person died, but before they did they said, here, have all of my money.
Right, take my money and be in charge of it. Totally believe about Lavina Murphy dying and George Donner, but I feel like it's more likely that like George Donner died and Kesselberg like looked at her with a gross, bloody, crazy smile, and she knew there was nothing standing between her and him, and she probably took off running from him and he chased her down and killed her. That's what happened, I bet.
It's the addition of the detail of her like wanting to leave and all that. He put too much shit into the story when he could have just been like, I went over there to check on them, they're both fucking dead.
Yeah, and if she fell in the creek, probably held her head underwater or something.
And so I tried to drown her in the creek. I mean, she fell in the creek?
She wouldn't have just taken off, I don't. Murphy didn't die until, it said within a week of them leaving, but it could have been 4 days, and then her husband died after that. So this was at least probably a week after the third leaf left, and I don't think she would have taken off a week behind.
Now, this is where I'll challenge your notions here. Would you stay in the camp with Kesselberg after I died?
No, you know what? Actually, you are.
So there, that might have been where her reasoning lied.
You're right. I mean, I'm cool with Kesselberg.
Wouldn't you just killed Kesselberg after the baby thing? Yeah, I would have. I don't know what I would have done, but I would have probably killed people in this story, though.
You definitely.
Oh, I would definitely.
It would have been your big.
Like some gun owners are, just hoping somebody gives them a reason.
Yeah, like, oh, finally.
Yeah, somebody break into my house so I could shoot them. I would have been far less scrupulous back then, and especially in a situation like this. No forensic science.
You would have been one of the grungy, stinky pirates who were rescued.
Yeah, I would have been on a gig. I would have been a gig guy like them. That's what I would have been. That's like an oil field job, right? Going out in relief effort to rescue.
Like, ooh, we're making $100 a day.
Right.
But yeah.
We're making a marginal amount of money every day for the time, for the forfeiture of a decent normal life.
You know, they had dollar signs in their mind of what they were going to be able to loot and pilfer from the scattered, discarded possessions.
Like sometimes being a cop, you can make some things disappear before it makes it to evidence.
It happens in the movies.
But you got to be careful, because if the Wire tells me anything, that they'll intercept a conversation between the people you confiscated confiscated the money from, and they're going to say, well, there's $26,000 missing. Well, how come we only picked up $20,000 flat?
Right.
I don't know. And they got all these fucking wagon manifests. Like, that come back a little lot.
Right.
I'm sure you could still make it out of there with some trinkets and stuff to sell.
And who's to say that a manifest didn't get destroyed or something?
It's like, unfortunately, the wagon manifests, though, were documented back home.
Yeah, true.
So you couldn't, like, Mac from Always Sunny eat the manifest before.
Excuse me, sir, can I see these supposed documents that you have?
Why, yes.
That's
right in your face! Yeah, you know, fortunately, I made hundreds of copies of that.
Yeah, but if they were documented back home, I mean, what are they going to do? Send somebody by horse to go get their manifest that from, where the hell are they from? From Missouri? Yeah, I don't know.
Also, I don't think, like, the gathering up of treasures and people's property was on any of their official agendas.
Yeah. It wasn't
there was
part
just,
of their,
they knew shit was out there.
It wasn't part of their job description. They just...
And I'm sure there were survivors that, like, oh, you were part of that effort? Did you didn't happen to find a ring or...
But, you know, there were entire families that were wiped out, so
and
they probably could
that
have
aren't going to miss it.
Yeah, they probably could have taken plenty of stuff and still gotten everything back to the survivors.
After Kesselberg had rattled off his dubious at best account, the men of the Fourth Relief weren't really buying it, at least not wholesale. He had a little money on him that he claimed was given to him by Tamsin, but they had it on pretty accurate record that wasn't all of it. So the men were getting impatient, and they were done wasting time listening to Kesselberg because they could just say he died. Just leave him there.
There wasn't anybody left.
So they string him up and momentarily hanged him until he started talking. They finally relent on this half-ass hanging when he coughed up the whereabouts of the rest of the money.
Of course, but then why wouldn't you just kill him? One of the more frustrating points in the story, which it's already really horrible, but this is him surviving and them not killing him right there on the spot. One of the more disappointing things about this story. Well, you'll see.
Yeah, it's really disappointing, and I'll get into it in a minute. Under duress, he would take him to the spot where he buried all the money and the other goodies. He planned, I guess, to recover them at a later time after rescue. Well, having looted to their collective heart's content, the Fourth Relief headed for home, with Louis Kesselberg bringing up the rear.
They weren't helping him out.
Yeah.
They were like, you can follow us if you want, but ask us for shit.
Nobody's taxiing this weird fuck. I imagine he's trailing the group a little bit because if he gets too close to somebody, they're just going to stab him.
Yeah.
Yeah, Louis Kesselberg, last man standing, and he was in it for the entire fucking go, and probably the individual in the story who ate more human flesh than anyone, and he would live for decades following his rescue, and he died a free man.
If you don't feel just a profound sense of disappointment at this moment,
as you'll see, people talked. Even back then, that word traveled. They knew all about this guy, and his life was not easy for the rest of it, which is a consolation prize, really. It's a very faint silver lining of the story. Once again, we're not 100% sure of these accounts, but there's a lot of them, and only him saying shit to the contrary.
Right.
There's others, but it's a very I said, they all said thing.
Yeah.
You'll see that he got a lot repercussions for it, all things considered, but his life pretty much sucked for the rest of it.
These stories are really hard to listen to when it's someone that you know did horrible things, like a football player that murdered his wife and her friend and got away with it, or like a young mother who clearly murdered her toddler and then lied about her being abducted by the nanny. Just
or a head of state.
Silly things like that.
Who faces no repercussions ever.
It's amazing.
People with money and political clout or big followings, they're not getting canceled. That's something you'll see over and over again in history.
At least the rest of his life wasn't awesome.
I mean, I hate in any story, unless it's fiction and it's done well. You hate to hear about anybody getting one over on the world and having been a shithead or done wrong. Kesselberg was so adamant at trying to erase his alleged history that he brought a defamation suit against a few of the men from the Fourth Relief, insinuated his complicity in the death of Tamsin Donner. He'd win, the court would award him an entire $1, and subsequently charged him for all the court costs too.
So you got a little sense of like, are you fucking kidding me? But you know, it's okay. Had to pay his $1 back.
Like trying to get some moral victory.
Yeah.
That was no help in the aftermath. In 1847, California Star was one of the first American newspapers published in California, printed a detailed account of Kesselberg's ghoulish activities and his near lynching by the Fourth Relief. One historian named Charles McGlashan claimed he had curated enough information that could indict Kesselberg for Tamsin Donner's murder. However, McGlashan would be of the opinion that no murder occurred after interviewing Kesselberg.
Yeah,
so he listened to the sob story, and that was it.
I can't. That's super infuriating. I can't understand how he can just talk to this guy knowing maybe he didn't kill her. Mm-hmm. But, like, knowing all the other shit he did, how could that not taint your entire outlook on going into this interview? And then you just let your whole guard down and believe whatever bullshit he tells you? Crazy.
Yeah, and that goes into the reading the story and hearing of the accounts and then actually meeting the person. Mm-hmm. You and I could talk about one of my acquaintances and, like, just run their name in the dirt, and you would have this built-up opinion of this person, but having actually been around the person can change your opinion.
Yeah, but you're not going to tell me that your acquaintance potentially murdered and ate several people, right. And, you know, so... But
this is an educated man and a historian, and he, by definition, has to keep a pretty open mind.
Yes, he's a historian. He's not a psychologist, someone who studies human behavior.
Yeah, but it's on the subject of making a complete indictment on a man. It gets iffy, but, like, for me, I completely shat on Kesselberg while I wrote this whole thing. Yeah. There's a page or two of shit I took out of this narrative that was just shitting on Kesselberg. Yeah, I don't know what he did, but I don't like him.
Right.
Fuck him.
Yeah.
And like I said, it doesn't matter anyway. This guy and I are hundreds of years apart, so...
Yeah.
So Kesselberg grew elderly and very reclusive. Not a lot of friends, I don't imagine, if any. He really couldn't go outside because of his status as a social pariah.
He kind of reminds me of Lizzie Borden. Mm-hmm. You know, she was acquitted, and then, like...
I don't think Lizzie did it.
That's a whole other...
I've looked into that.
If she did it, she was fucking Houdini. She was like... His story reminds me of that.
I love the connection to other folk crime,
Yeah, though. After she was acquitted of her parents' murder, she had to go... She moved out of town, but everybody knew kids in her town would go in her front yard and sing. Everybody knows that Lizzie Borden took an axe.
And she behaved suspiciously, but she was somebody that kind of had a secret anyway.
Well, and everybody thought she was...
being a possible lesbian.
Yeah, everybody thought she was weird because she never was married. And
like I said, McGlashan sat and listened to Kesselberg's sob story because he was openly threatened in public. That wasn't no fucking bullshit. Like, in the interview he gave McGlashan, Kesselberg lamented, "I often think that the Almighty has singled me out among all men on the face of the earth in order to see how much hardship, suffering, and misery a human being can bear." If I were on the fence and I heard that, I'd go, guilty. Fuck this guy.
That's the thing. This guy was a historian. He wasn't an expert at reading people. It's ridiculous. There are so many murderers just in the last 30, 40, 50 years that do the same shit. They'll say that stuff until they die. Can't believe them. They're bullshit. They've said the exact same thing since humans existed, and they've been murdering each other since the dawn of their existence. And half of them will, it's just everybody's so mean to me, and they've just got it out for me. So.
And like back then, there was more of a stoicism to people, and I'm guessing, and like, I mean, hell, if you hear like a middle-aged man nowadays talk, they'll criticize our generation and younger ones for being so open emotionally and so willing to share personal mental stuff.
Yeah.
I imagine this isn't something that McGlashan had thrown at him a whole lot, so like it may have touched him a little bit. I've opened myself up in the past for like altruistic, misguided reasons of listening to people and like letting them get their shit out, being some kind of free amateur therapist or whatever the fuck I was trying to do. If you have that thrown at you a lot, your empathy can become overloaded and like just short out, and you go, okay, what is this person trying to sell me? If you've read people or been around people at all and talked to them and listened to sob stories, a lot of times you could see this person's fucking bullshitting me for one, or you could see like, yeah, I hear you and you've got problems and hardships, but because of the shit you did and brought on yourself.
Right. So basically what you're saying is McGlashan wasn't used to seeing especially grown men just crying and pitying themselves. So it's like, oh my God, it must be real.
And the dramatics of it is what gets me of the notion that God had singled him out in particular as a Job 2.0 to see how much suffering, motherfucker, you ate people. Even if you didn't kill Tamsin, you arrogantly ate people.
You ate a baby.
Well, listen up, City Jim. I ate a baby. Oh, aye, baby. The other white meat. Baby, it's what's for dinner.
I mean, all 5 of George and Tamsin's children survived, so that branch of the Donner family made it out with their offspring at least. The family of George's brother Jacob, of course, didn't fare as well, having lost 6 of the 9 members. All of the Reeds survived. The Reeds made it completely intact, more or less, as humans, living, allegedly, without resorting to cannibalism.
Yeah, let them have that. Her husband got exiled, and she was stuck with her kids. If she can't bear the shame and guilt of letting them eat people, then let her have it. That's fine.
there weren't snarky people like me back then that go, oh yeah, sure.
I mean, we know.
Yeah.
They survived. They literally didn't starve to death. They had to have been eating something, but whatever.
You'll see that the Reed family and James Reed made it out of this smelling like a fucking rose.
Yeah, I know.
Considering that his leadership got him to the place that shit got bad, and it's not the Reed party we're talking about, of course. It's the Donner Party. So that may have something to do with the fact it's called the Donner Party, because if we called it the Reed Party and they didn't lose anybody, it wouldn't have that effect. And also because they made it there and were at least contributors to the history we know today. And as you know, history is written by the victors.
Reed, it's like, I know there's a movie, somebody accidentally throws a cigarette into some dry grass and it burns down an orphanage, but then he runs in and saves a handful of kids, and it's like, oh, he's a hero, he put himself in danger, you know, but he got everybody else killed.
Like people that orchestrate tragedies so they can become a hero and all of it. And all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's like the kind of name where firefighters and stuff will do that. I mean, obviously, it's probably not as prevalent as like Criminal Minds makes it seem like it is, but you know.
And despite having the most members, the Breen family didn't lose anyone.
Wow, that's crazy.
And Margaret Breen would, of course, especially thank John Stark for this, because he saved all 7 of the children incrementally.
Wow. Yeah.
Carrying them to salvation little by little.
She owes him big.
Oh, definitely.
Why didn't anybody bring some type of, well, I guess it wouldn't work, I don't know, but like they couldn't bring any kind of makeshift gurney or something, like not gurney, but something they could have dragged behind them or something.
Right, like a little sled thing.
Yeah, like a sled. They couldn't have taken a wheelbarrow or something. A little sled.
Yeah, did they not have anything on wheels? Did they just all take out on foot? I know they had to have something to carry shit back in.
Yeah, I mean, presumably a wagon could have made it, but you know, something small.
I think it had to do with it being practical. He could easily just scoop up a kid and
well, that's
put
what
him
I'm
on his
saying.
hip and walk.
Taking just a little, make like a canvas with 2 sticks on each side, just to set the kids on the cloth and drag them or something.
That story reminds me of the boss I had on my road construction job. No names mentioned. You know, usually you're like, oh, we got to move this piece of equipment. So you and another guy hop in a pickup truck and you drive over there. One of you hops in the piece of equipment and drives it to wherever it needs to be, and then hops back in the pickup truck and y'all go back to what you're doing. But in his 60s, it was in very good shape to move the equipment. He'd move something like a few hundred yards down the road, jog back to the other thing, drive it 100 or so yards past that piece of equipment, jog back, and like kept leapfrogging the shit until he'd moved 2 pieces of equipment fucking 3 miles down the road or wherever. Yeah, good on him for being in that good a shape, but I sure as shit would never fucking did anything that way. He was just showing off. I knew the guy knew efficiency better. He was just grandstanding. Of all the animal members of the Donner Party, only 3 mules would make it to California.
Wow, that surprises me.
Yeah.
If there were any mules left that didn't die or get eaten.
Yeah.
Why the fuck didn't anyone eat these mules?
Now, the mules were just so bitter and pessimistic and despondent, as I think that like mules would be. It was just too lazy to run away.
Well, that's my point.
Nobody's
How did they not get eaten?
Mule.
The children didn't just attack the mules, ravenous.
The survivors would live full lives, and some would be exceptionally successful. But these lives would not be without the post-traumatic stress.
Well, that didn't exist back
yeah,
then.
It doesn't exist now. Who are you kidding? None of that shit exists. You're all just fucked up, and you're all weenies. All pussies.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of the widows of the expedition would find husbands within months of being rescued. And brides were a scarce commodity in California at the time.
Right.
They were all just stinky mountain men that made it.
There were probably overrun with these stinky mountain men, but as far as anyone would want to spend time with, probably pretty slim pickings. But, you know, these poor women were kind of desperate.
The Reeds would settle down in San Jose. James Reed would find himself in quite a lucrative position and prosper greatly during the gold rush that would come a few years later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as pissed about this, but that leaves a bad taste in my mouth anyway. And I would put money on the fact he probably didn't use any of those funds to contribute to any of the families of people who he kind of fucked over.
According to this, as you'll find, he kept some rapport with some of the survivors, but the Breens would open an inn in San Juan Bautista. A journalist, J. Ross Brown, would write a story for Harper's Magazine in 1862 about staying at the inn and being deeply disturbed to learn that his lodgings provided by a family of cannibals.
Oh, fuck this.
This fucking dandy journalist.
Yeah, looking down his nose. Oh, that's
it's all sensationalism. You see the same shit today in journalism. Yellow journalism came after regular journalism was invented. It's all bullshit. As soon as they figured out there were people reporting the news, there were people that were, and we can interject our intentions,
our biases, and
like what we want to come from the writing, and basically make it propaganda. Tell people what what we want them to hear and shape how we want to influence people.
Right. It's very possible that he was not disturbed at all. He just was saying that to, I did this thing and it was so spooky.
If kind of fearmonger and drum up interest in the headlines and influence people, but also do it in a way that they don't know they're being influenced.
Right. And back then, that probably was a huge deterrent and probably really impacted the success of their end. But today, it would probably be like a tourist hotspot.
And Brown, when he wrote it, he kept his subjects anonymous, but people knew who he was talking about. That stigma would surround the survivors for the rest of their lives. So the Donner children, now orphaned, they were taken in by an older couple near Sutter's Fort. And Eliza, who was only 3 during the whole ordeal, published a book on the events in 1911 based on printed accounts and accounts from her sisters, which I have a little bit of a problem with that, but I'll touch on it coming up. Nancy Graves was 9 years old during the terrible winter. She refused to acknowledge anything about the events, even when contacted by genuine historians hoping to get an accurate account. Any mention of anything concerning the Donner Party would elicit tears from her. She would never recover mentally from eating her own mother and brother at starved camp. Sarah Graves, who had been widowed, got to destination and she would marry. She was widowed, of course, when Jay Fosdick died. Unfortunately, she'd be widowed again because her second husband would be lynched in accusations of stealing a mule.
Oh, this poor woman.
Pile it on.
She's never going to find anybody that fiddles like Jay did anyway.
And her husband sold that mule. All I've got to say is I hope that ass was worth it.
Allegedly. Allegedly.
Allegedly. He allegedly did that shit so I could make that bad joke.
That was a very good joke. He wouldn't have been the only one to get lynched over a little ass.
Mary Graves married one of her rescuers in 1847. He would be murdered the next year. Another one of the now fatherless Graves sisters is widowed. And she cooked for and fed meals to her husband's murderer because she wanted him to be healthy and survive long enough to be hanged.
Was he imprisoned at the time?
Yes.
Or she would take meals to the jail? Okay.
She wanted to make sure that he was healthy and able whenever they strung him up.
Yeah, good for her. There's not a lot of joy probably in her life, so that little amount of satisfaction at least, good for her.
Yeah, Mary's grandchildren remembered her as being a very serious woman, if you could imagine. Mary once said, "I wish I could cry, but I cannot. If I could forget the tragedy, perhaps I would know how to cry again."
Wow, that's messed up.
Wow.
I mean, this left her a shell.
She's probably borderline lobotomized, just dead and only functional. There's no extra anything there. There's no life there.
Probably a very literal woman.
Right.
No words uttered without precise intention.
In a state of perpetual disassociation.
Because as a person, she's probably just running on autopilot, trying to not think of anything.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean...
Or derealization and dissociation.
Your brain does shit to help you survive. That's not very far-fetched to think that she just shut down.
Now, whether it was Foster or Eddie that threatened Kasseberg, because some places are switched in and out.
One of those Williams.
He figured out where Kasseberg lived, but he was convinced against finishing off the fiend by his old pal James Reed. So James Reed stepped in and said, "Hey, it's fucking forget about it. It's not worth it."
Listen, James Reed murdered somebody. The happy dancing guy from the original group. He murdered that guy for whacking the other guy on the head.
Right, but James Reed murdered a guy past the Continental Divide where there's no law. Even though we're in California now, which is remote from any kind of early American normal standard civilizations, there's still enough people here where they've established that if you kill somebody, we're gonna at least imprison you or kill you back for it. So like James Reed said, "Hey, don't fucking get yourself in trouble." Yeah, basically.
I guess you're right.
He's like, "Yeah, I know he has it coming, but there are rules."
This is not Nam, but there are rules.
William, whoever it was, is just not creative enough.
He made too much of a stink about it instead of just going to fucking get it done. You know what? Don't tell people about what you're gonna do.
Don't tell them your
plans.
Go
fucking do it and then tell them about it. Well, no, that's like a thing. If you don't go tell everybody, "Hey, I'm writing a book," write the book and get a little bit done before you start.
Yeah. If you're going to write a book or if you're going to murder somebody, just go do it. Yeah. And then when you're done,
there'll be plenty of time to tell your story, and true crime podcasters throughout the rest of the time will be talking about your quotes. But just get out there and do it. Just do it.
Do it. Murder's bad.
Yeah, I'm not trying to...
You're not trying to convince your listeners to go kill somebody? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm not trying to incept the idea into their head with some kind of subliminal messages. Isabella Breen was 1 year old during the Donner disaster. She died in 1935, and she was the last survivor of the Donner Party.
She was pretty old. What year was that they set out?
1840s.
Yeah, so she had a long...
She made a long time. As for Lansford Hastings...
Oh, yes, the conductor of this shit symphony that we've been learning about.
He would get some death threats and lambasting, but ultimately his life would go on to business as usual because he was rich, and that's how things work. So this wasn't life-ruining for him. They didn't cancel Lansford Hastings either. Like later, he would join the Confederacy during the Civil War, despite being being a Northern Yankee, and despite being the ally to some of the staunchest unionists.
God damn, he's
just opportunist.
He's an opportunist. That's all he is. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not enough to lie to people and like, oh, this is a great way to get to this place. It's like somebody trying to convince you to buy mercury powder to mix in your drinks so your skin stays nice and bright or something. No. I've never done it, and I don't know that it won't kill you, but you should do it anyway. And now he's joining up with the Confederacy. And he's an ally to the Unionists.
It's all business to him.
I know,
it's just a shamelessness to it that
the
speaks.
Shamelessness never fails to amaze me. Just the utter shamelessness.
The shamelessness,
having
you can
no
see
values.
it in just cut and dry facts.
Yeah.
That you could tell and surmise that this guy was a consummate businessman, and anything he did that was shown to the contrary was just damage control and covering his ass in the story. And just oops, everybody got mad. So the only reason I'm crawfishing on anything is because everybody got their panties in a twist.
Yeah, ooh, you're following that trail I had in my guide, huh? I just got back from there, and you might want to go the other way.
Long before politics really got in full swing in the United States as far as what we know today and how things work, and it was before the modern times. Hastings had a press conference or some shit like that where he'd come out and was like, my bad, guys. I mean, it was before the Roger Stone type political strategy of just political narcissism where you don't apologize for anything or admit to fault in anything. Never apologize for anything, admit mistakes, or even if you're found in wrongdoing, try to justify the wrongdoing because it's you that's doing it.
If you can't convince someone you didn't do it, you have to either convince them that it wasn't a bad thing that they did, or that someone else did it, or that it was that person's fault.
If you've ever read The Narcissist Prayer,
that didn't happen, and if it did, it wasn't that bad. If it was, that's not a big deal. And if it is, that's not my fault. If it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserved it.
You can find an example of where the narcissist was at a certain point of the narcissist prayer of justification for their actions. Lansford Hastings just said my bad and went on with it. This isn't really going to hurt me or affect me either way, but I'm going to go, oops. So some people, and he can just go back to doing whatever bullshit, snake oil, con man shit he wanted to do. But the reason he joined up with the Confederacy, because he was still trying to capture California as his own, and he was hoping for funding to annex it and along with Arizona into the Confederacy and have it be under his leadership. But the funding was never approved, but they let him be an honorary major in the Confederate Army as a consolation gift out of the whole thing. So he got some prestige from it, I guess. He got another title. But that's basically the end of this story. Once again, my main source for the story is The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. If you want to get really deep into the nitty-gritty and real specifics. If you want to hear more cannibalism stuff, you can study a man named Alfred Packer. Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D, Packer. Like the Green Bay Packers. Alfred.
His parents, when he was born, his parents had heard the name before, but they had no fucking clue how to spell it.
And you can't really, I'm not astute enough to know if this was a common spelling of the time or if somebody's name's a typo.
Yeah, I bet it is. Like Oprah, her name was supposed to be like Orpha or something like that.
Orpha.
And they spelled it wrong on her birth certificate or some shit.
It's not a accurate dramatization of the events. You can watch Trey Parker and Matt Stone's college collaboration film that is now carried by Trauma, the people who made Toxic Avenger and some other great pulpy, trashy movies like that. It was named something else, but it's called Cannibal, ! The musical. And that's a fun watch. If you want to watch the South Park guys do some of their earliest work. Yeah. It's also got Squeak from Basketball in it, so that's fun.
If you listen to the show, there's a pretty good chance you've probably already seen it.
But that's the Donner Party, and I'm glad it was a lot of work that I'm not going to be paid for, but I'm glad I worked this narrative into the more standard episode format that I have now than when I started. Like I said, it's the first history piece I did for the podcast, and it went through many stages where it was going to be initially a podcast segment, and then I started writing it. It took on a life of its own and just kept flowing with page after page of shit. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'm going to write a book, and this will be the Horrible History Abridged book, and this will be one segment, 1/4 of the book or whatever. And then I needed friends and family and peers and stuff to review it for me and read it. But send somebody 50 pages of your own writing and try to get them to read it. It is a fucking battle. You don't want to come on too strong and be like, hey, have you read that thing? But yeah, you need other people's eyes on this shit before you decide decide if you want to go forward with it. So then finally I said, fuck it, I'm going to read it to you. So like I recorded it as its own podcast in 5 pieces back in the day because I didn't know my ass from a hole in the ground about how long each episode should be or whatever. I still have problems with consistency concerning those things. So I'm glad to have this in a format that matches the rest of it. I don't know if I'm going to touch the old stuff again, like the actual old draft of it that had all this snark and shit in it, or if I'm ever going to read that again. Production values haven't risen and the sound quality hadn't got good enough to like justify redoing that, so that's going to be left as is for the time being. And if you want to read it bad enough or hear it bad enough, you can go listen to the older, shittier recordings. Not like anything we do now is of pristine sound quality, but I didn't even have microphones back then. I was talking to the laptop and I was by myself. You can go listen to that, or I can send it to you if you are just that curious. I can send you an actual text.
Yeah, if you think, you know what, these few hours I've been listening to this, it wasn't enough. I just want to hear more. I want to hear the story again. And I want to hear Zach just a little grumpier and more drunk.
Yeah, he's a little more alcohol intake and but more energy to just be an asshole.
If you got a hankering for very specific,
go pop open that time capsule of mental illness. Like you go listen to the old one, you're going to hear me fuck up all the time and read really badly and just any extra shit I throw in there. You know, it takes a lot to get anything rewarding out of this anymore, even though it's like my only hobby, my most productive creative outing. So I do feel that little bit of dopamine for having finished this and made it into the kind of episode that is standard fare for One More Mosh Pit and Horrible History Abridged. So I'm glad to have it. Also, I'm glad to convey another story from history that is really of a gory and scary and, like I said, just a tick all the boxes story for me that gave me that good creepy feeling while learning. And I'm glad I could share all these ghastly accounts with all of you today.
Yes, I'm glad too, because that was horrible.
But it's history. You guys, I hope you keep coming back, and I hope you keep listening, and I don't know what the end game on all this is, but maybe some Mosh Pit production made possible by listeners like you and Manic Nervous Energy. I'm not going to list everywhere we're at because basically if you search for us there, you'll find us there. We're on every platform for podcast or videos. We're on YouTube now, so I make videos whenever I feel like it. This whole thing may be going full video pretty soon. I don't know how much longer we got with this podcast, but I'm going to get real weird with it. If you liked what you heard here today, tell your friends, tell everyone. If you didn't like what you heard here today, you keep your whore mouth shut. One More Mosh Pit music written and performed by Blake Foster. Check him out with his band, Chainsaw Lassie.